So we have Katherine MacLean with us. You saw her in the film, Psychedelic Researcher Extraordinaire. And we have Pat Murphy, the filmmaker, with us both. Fantastic film, Pat.
Thank you.
So if you guys want comments about the film, questions, you have, a great inside person here with Katherine to give you some of the details that you may or may not want to know about psychedelic space. And feel free to either, I guess, type your question in the chat, or I don't know if there's a raise your hand function. I guess there is, right? So you can just do, although I'd have to be able to see you guys to be able to do that. Let's see if I can do that. Yeah, so you guys would have to show your videos and raise your hands for that. So in the meantime, why don't we just get started with the mystical experience in general. What is the mystical experience? And there's the power of the mystical experience. So what is the power in the mystical experience? And Katherine or Pat, do you want to maybe start with that and we'll take it from there?
Yeah, Katherine's kind of more the expert, so I think it'd be great if she wants to answer.
I feel like the power of the mystical experience is it's the universe speaking directly to you. And so you're going to experience it as the most personal, intimate, pure channel of the truth that's ever been taught to you. And so, the variety of experiences that we saw at Hopkins was, oh, there, am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay. Just the variety of experiences that we saw at Hopkins was as great as the types of individuals that we had. And yet each person, I think, comes out of it feeling like the message and the experience and what they went through was exactly what they, it was for them. And I think that that's probably more powerful than any other religion or spiritual tradition that exists, because it's never going to be so specific to you. I mean, some would argue maybe Zen or some types of Buddhism, when you get to the end, it's ultimately only for you, no matter what your teacher taught you. But I think that's the thing that's always just really inspiring to me, is that each person is going to get the exact thing that they need. It may not be the thing they want or what they're expecting, but they'll get the thing that's for them. And my mentor, Bill, always told me it's like this perfect, it's like an opera of your life. And it's for you. And like your subconscious interacting with the universe is like prepared this opera for you. And all you have to do is like sit back and receive it. And it's just like an opera, there's going to be like tragedy and comedy and like, all these like moments of like tension. But once you get to the end of the opera, then you're like, oh, what a beautiful show. It's just for you. So.
I love that analogy, because opera is such an intense art form, isn't it? And it kind of, that analogy really expresses the nature of the experience. It looks like, is it Ryan? Do you have a question?
Yeah. First off, that was amazing. That honestly should be like fucking Psychedelics 101. Let's face it, that was perfect. That was so structured well. It was visually beautiful. You had the perfect quotes. That was awesome. Back in the day, I ran this thing called the Synesthesia Film Festival in San Francisco. It was a once a month short film festival, and we ran it for 11 months. It was basically, honestly, a marketing experiment to actually figure out what was the best film festival. So we took the best genres of films and we ranked them. And at the end of the actual screening, there was a shot that came up that was a Google questionnaire about like which ones they liked the most. They could have the top 3, so we had to run off vote. I was honestly looking for exactly this. This was fucking amazing. So I got to ask you this question. I noticed it's an hour. Why didn't you go for 90 minutes for feature? And if this is an hour, are you aiming for like a TV series? because I got these motherfuckers over here at Netflix down the street from where I live, and they're driving me nuts about like, when you're going to give me some content. And I'm like, I'm working on it, but I haven't found anybody yet. And I'm like, you already did the damn job. So like, what's the plan? Why is it an hour? Are you going to do 12? You should honestly run it, just maybe 10. Don't overwhelm yourself. But seriously, put that shit together. It was gorgeous. And you got the top people. So, I mean, fuck yeah. That's it. I just wanted to mention that, and I wanted to know. That's my question. What's
great. This is, I gotta say, that is like one of the best pieces of feedback I think I've gotten in one of these events so far. You know, I guess with the hour, I was originally thinking PBS. I was thinking a PBS documentary, and PBS is usually an hour. So that's kind of how I settled on an hour. But then I've been working on this thing, like I started making this 9 years ago. So it's been just an incredibly long process of editing and re-editing and restructuring. And I got to the point where like you start to hate it. You watch it so many times that I just felt like I wanted to condense it as much as possible. But I've heard mixed things. Some people say, I'm so glad that it was an hour. And then other people say, oh, it could have been a little bit longer and maybe you could expand on some things. So look,
I worked on back in the day in 2010 in Michigan on this documentary about what would cannabis legalization look like. And we broke it down by 4 major sections. It's, you know, like, what's your access, what's the quality, what's the price, and like, what do you do for all the people that already got thrown into jail for this sort of thing. And I ended up getting sucked up into this whole absurd campaign, but I learned a lot of tricks in the process. And I got to say, like, you guys nailed that. That's literally, I had a call from a woman that was actually going to apply to multiple schools for psychedelic research studies and therapies. And like, she knew like, and she's a smart person, but she knew only 15% of what she really needed to know. You literally broke it down as the perfect 1 hour thing. Like, I could see professors just rolling out like massive term papers on this sort of thing, like explain what it is and go back and analyze it. You guys absolutely crushed it. So if you're going for PBS, I mean, honestly, there's so many crappy psychedelic content videos out there, and I'm just like losing my mind, and it's perfect. So I'm not just asking this as a question, I'm telling you, you have to fucking do this. You have to produce the rest of this. And the quality, I mean, you got the interviews, you got the old like footage found that was perfect. Oh my God, if you really had to lay this out, and I want to ask you, if you had an extra 30 minutes, because I know you probably were sitting on like, what, 100 hours worth of footage, and the nightmare is like, how the fuck do I go through all of this stuff and classify it out? You absolutely have to add an extra 30 minutes to this if you're going to make it a feature, so you can actually get it into a theater, so it's actually like documentary worthy for nomination. I literally live in Hollywood. It's down the street from me. Netflix picked up this theater, they're rolling it in, and they have the Oscars across the street. That's why they picked it. So it's a combinational thing. That was amazing. Like, I haven't seen anything that good ever. And by the way, like the name of my film festival was the Synesthesia Film Festival, and we crushed it with short films, but we could never find anything as good as that. That was phenomenal. So I'm gonna shut up for a minute. Just go.
Well, does Netflix not buy 1 hour documentaries? Does it have to be an hour and a half? I know that's more.
No, they want shows. They want 10 episodic shows, either 30 minutes or 60 minutes. 30 minutes is for comedies, 60 minutes for everything else if you can pull it off.
So to me, I for some reason I struggle with imagining like an hour and a half version of this. What I can imagine is doing a series. So there's so much ground covered in an hour in this film. I would love to break it up into like a 10-part series where you start with like the indigenous use, and then maybe you know, its relationship with like religion, and then go into, you know, break it up into 10 episodes.
You could take it apart for every single factor you wanted to focus on, and there are so many, and they're brilliant, and Paul knows a fuck ton about that. So I'm sorry, I'm shutting up again.
No, that's great. Thank you. I love the enthusiasm. I love
Brian's enthusiasm also. But just you know, Brian is the campaign director for Decrim California, just so you guys know, with getting legalization of psilocybin and more this time around, perhaps on the ballot.
Yeah.
Coming up. So any other questions immediately coming up, or I can continue with what we were talking about a little bit before with, like Julie Holland comes in and says that you come away changed, from a mystical experience. And so for Katherine, it would be great, what your thoughts might be on what is that change and how does that relate perhaps to someone's early trauma? Because we've seen some people like, shall I say the QAnon shaman who's, obviously been doing psychedelics, but maybe hasn't been changed in a way that we might think or like, So if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot to unpack. I was actually just sharing with you that one of my closest friends is the first volunteer that I guided through the Hopkins study. So we've known each other for over 10 years. And she actually had a challenging first session and then she had to be discontinued from the study for a medical reason. And so we could become friends, which was nice because if she was still in the study, we couldn't be friends. And so I feel like that's one of the greatest gifts from the study is getting to know one of the first participants, as a real person. And we were just chatting and she said, it's a mystical experience isn't going to be the thing that like sets you on the right track for the rest of your life. But it could be if you have the right kind of intention and preparation and mindset to accept that path that's kind of revealed for you. And so as many times as I saw people jump to like a new path and follow it, like I just remembered for the first time in a while that this one young guy was working for the Department of Defense, like literally like either like engineering or something, those drones that like drop bombs from, thousands of miles away. And he stopped doing that work and he went to Thailand and he is working for a nonprofit and like is a yoga teacher. And so that's like a major redirecting, of experience. And, is he a different person or was he just kind of like in one rut? And then this mystical experience kind of like helped him jump out of that rut and find a better path. And then there are also a lot of people that, would go through the whole high support, high dose integration for 6 months and come out of it doing the same thing that they did before they started the study, just with, I think, maybe a deeper sense of meaning or purpose in their life that they had already chosen. As for the QAnon shaman, luckily I don't follow too much of the news. I know a little bit, but I don't have to go to that extreme of an example. I think there are enough people suffering from this kind of crippling level of like self-obsession. Narcissism is such an overused word, but like in the psychedelic community, I think you see people who just become, it's like a repetitive loop where all they do is repeatedly focus on themselves with each higher and higher experience that they have. And it becomes a harmful thing. And so it's like, well, why don't psychedelics work for them? It's like, what's missing in that equation? Because they obviously have the sense of purpose and meaning and, enthusiasm. A friend of mine who lives in Jamaica now says that for her, the mushroom experience comes down to humility. And she said that for a lot of Americans, and especially a lot of American males, you need very, very, very high doses to crack the super strong personality that's already set. And it's like at Hopkins, we saw pretty big changes in, in some aspects of personality, but those people were open to that kind of change. And so, I could speculate about how that kind of narcissism in adulthood is created by childhood experiences, adverse childhood experiences. But lots of things are created by adverse childhood experiences, not just that result. And so then we get to the trauma, and trauma is like this big taboo that's probably bigger than psychedelics. For us, we think trauma is just normal. Everyone talks about it. But for most people, trauma is like, they don't even know what you're talking about. They're like, what do you mean that person has trauma? Well, it's like, well, you have it too. Like, if you had even a normal childhood, you have trauma. And so I think that maybe is like the next step as a community that we can take, is like normalizing the discussion of trauma and adverse childhood experiences. And that's when I think maybe the psychedelic mystical experience thing is going to become more relevant to a lot more people. It's not just something that is for people who are really screwed up or have a diagnosis, but it's like, it's for all of us because we're all traumatized. And most of us didn't have, you know, the perfect childhood, even with parents who are really trying their best. And so I think that's where it kind of comes full circle. It's like, let's bring it back to like the regular person's life. And just like that opera, it's like has a beginning. And there was a lot of experiences that happened before you were an adult. And those experiences determine who you are as an adult. And so you can't just jump in with the psychedelic at 30 years old and address the things that you remember since you were 20 and not really get underneath the surface and address all the things that happened from 0 to 20.
Right. That makes sense. And, you know, I'm thinking of developmental trauma, which is what you're talking about, right? With the adverse childhood experiences and the narcissism and all of that stuff can be pre-verbal as well. You know, some people have had psychedelic experiences that are very somatic, uncomfortable, you know, which it's hard to know, is that directly pre-verbal experiences? And then how does that relate? Could that stop someone from having a mystical experience, for example?
I'll just give one quick anecdote, and there's probably different questions, but it was, for example, it was not uncommon for some, especially women in the study, who kind of got through the whole screening protocol as healthy, mentally healthy, physically healthy, no history of psychiatric diagnoses, no trauma. And then it was only once they really fully trusted the people who were guiding them through the session that they could admit to some pretty horrific, you know, abuse experiences that they'd had either as children or young adults or growing up. And they'd never said it to anyone before in their life. And it's like, this is a really high functioning person who's passed really grueling screening, like has convinced all of these professionals that she's totally fine. And like the amount of how frequently it started happening. I remember asking one of my mentors, Mary, I said, is this really this common? And she's like, yeah. And I was like, oh my God. Like, it was almost like the psilocybin was the excuse to finally unload this thing that people had been carrying for so long. And, you know, it depends on the person, but what an opportunity to finally trust someone else and be like, here, I can't carry it. You now get to, you know, hold it with me. And then the psilocybin was just the fun thing you got to do after you finally unloaded that secret.
Wow.
And it's like, how healthy could our planet be if everyone finally just like let go of the thing they've been holding on to for 40, 50 years?
Wow.
They don't have to like go around harming everyone in their life incidentally because they can't deal with this thing. And so that's a thing you don't really hear about in the, you know, in the papers or the films. It's like these like much more personal moments that have not much to do with psilocybin. So
that's really a testament to the safety that you guys created there. You know, to have people be finally willing to come forth with all that at that time.
Yeah.
So I think we have a question from Sol. Am I right? Yeah. Go ahead.
I had two questions, one for you, Katherine, and one for you, Pat. Katherine, it sounds like you came into psychedelics as more like through academia. Like at which point, and I assume, or I guess part of my question is, do you also study yourself experientially, and how did you jump, I guess, from academia into your personal experience, if that jump happened? And then my question for Pat is, how did you come into this world? And like, I'm assuming you have your own personal experience, and I'm kind of curious, you know, how you kind of went down this rabbit hole, you know, came to produce this crazy film. That's it.
I didn't have to jump. So my fascination with the terrain that psychedelics eventually illuminated, like, was always there for me. Like, I was the kind of 10-year-old who was reading Stephen King, and like I was really fascinated by like the bizarre, supernatural underworld, like the stuff that was beyond normal. And so the first time that I took mushrooms, it was like that world came alive in my real life. So it's like this like fantasy world that I had experienced through literature was like suddenly real. So it felt very familiar. And when I joined the Hopkins team, the main jump was the relief that I could finally study the thing that I had been like obsessed with for so long.
So you were already in it then.
Yeah, I was in it. And
Sure.
the hard part about Hopkins was having to pretend I wasn't. So it's like, that was also like it was really like, I didn't realize like I'd have to do this, like, so I was like, wait, we're all in this because we're personally fascinated, right? And it's like, yes, but you can't say that. And I didn't understand that, like, now people, I think it's safer for people to come out, but Nishay Devaneux was one of the first scientists who was like, you need to come out of the psychedelic closet. And like Carl Hart now has a book that's like taking drugs for grownups. It's like, if you use drugs and you're, you know, you're functioning in your life and you can like, you need to say that, because it's like, we need better examples of people who've taken psychedelics and other drugs and also have a lovely life, or have like accomplished things, or like have something worthwhile to offer. So anyway, it's easier now because I'm not an academic, so I don't have to do the like.
Oh, thank you for that.
How old were you, Katherine?
18.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really, I've noticed, I think it's since the Michael Pollan book came out, maybe, but I've noticed a shift in the past couple of years where like public figures are much more willing to talk about their personal experiences. When I first started making the film, because it was so long ago when I was making this, I was a film student at the time. It was much more stigmatized, I would say. But my background is like, I was really, I still am, but at the time I was really fascinated by the counterculture of the 60s. Just like the music that came out of that era and the cultural changes that came out of that era, and just kind of the spirit of it. I was really fascinated by it, and almost felt like in a previous life I had been there somehow. I mean, I felt really deep kinship with it. So then when I was a film student, I heard about a study at the NYU School of Medicine using psilocybin with cancer patients. And that really piqued my interest because I wasn't aware of psychedelics in a sort of therapeutic context. And the idea of it being studied at a university by these doctors and FDA approved, that was also all new to me. And it was in that process that I started learning about the history in the 60s in psychiatry, sort of before the counterculture, and how it was a research tool back then. So the academic sort of side of it was like very new to me at the time. But I felt like if I made a film with that academic perspective, it would make it much more digestible for a sort of general audience. And that if you sort of approach it with like a historical and scientific background, that people will kind of listen to you more easily. So that's kind of why I took that angle.
Cool.
You asked about the age. I did want to just add that the experience that I had that really shifted my understanding of what taking psychedelics was, though, was when I was 33. So, I mean, between 18 and 33, I had a lot of what I would call haphazard experiences. And I didn't understand until I had a mystical experience that wasn't drug related. Like it's like that illuminated this totally different landscape for me, that then the psychedelic piece could kind of come back in and like help me navigate. But that period of time where I was using psychedelics more haphazardly, I would say was not therapeutic. And it wasn't really even intentional. I mean, it's like I had an intention, but I think you could spend a lot of time as a young person taking a lot of psychedelics without it going anywhere. And so that's where I think the piece that I learned at Hopkins and that people have elaborated on in recent years with like integration and community support, it's like, that's a totally different level. And I think if young people can have that kind of context, I think it's totally safe and it's reasonable for, 16, 17, 18-year-olds to have an experience like this. But if they don't have that context, it can just be a waste of, or it can be entertaining and fun and all those other things, but therapeutically, it's not really gonna just work on its own, I don't think.
One quick question about that. Thank you for sharing. Do you feel like it happened in your 30s as opposed to in your teens due to your age or due to how you engaged in it? Or do you think you could have had that experience when you were 18, 17, 21?
It's a great question. I don't think I personally could have, because it was the experience I had when I was 32 that precipitated, this shift, was a major loss in my life. If that loss had happened when I was 16 or 17, then yes, maybe I would have been broken open enough to have. And I think there are some 15-year-olds who've had that kind of loss, who've had to face that abyss. For them, they're just like, bring it on. Like, I've seen the worst that life can give me. But for me, most of my life was very protected and safe and lovely. And, I had a lot going on. So it's like, I wouldn't have seen that abyss was there, except for this trauma that kind of like revealed it. And it ultimately, ended up being a great thing. And that's why I think there's a quote about, it might even be a songwriter that's like, everything has cracks or everything is broken, and that's how the light gets in. And so it's just like, I think that trauma can actually be a major vehicle for transformation. And we're almost seeing it the opposite way. It's like, we're not fixing people with trauma. It's like people with trauma have the potential to have these amazing experiences because of the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, they have a gift in a way that they're bringing to the science. It's like they're revealing the most that people can change because they have that opening. So it's, I'd like to kind of reframe what trauma can do for people, because I think it is it can be a major gift if you know how to use it with the right context.
I totally hear that. And I feel the same way. To the degree that I've seen people who have been in gnarly places with themselves, either in abuse, drug, physical, whatever it is, I've seen some of the hugest contrasts and shifts in like them. And, to the degree that they were here is to the degree that they're wide open and just like mad about it over here in a beautiful way. Yeah. Thanks.
There's one thing that I thought was really intriguing was the original alcohol study and that kind of protocol that they did. They met with people for a week. They gave them a low dose as a group, and the next week, and then the week after that, they did a solo. And I believe the protocol, and you can let me know for sure on this, Katherine, when possible, they would give a lower dose psilocybin before the higher dose, and maybe they didn't even need to do the higher dose depending on what happened. But I thought I read that somewhere, but as one possible way. But I guess, it's kind of interesting how that all came about. And I wonder if they were trying to create mystical experiences, because they didn't actually explain it that way in that particular study. They were trying to cure people of alcohol, and they didn't say what it was that was perhaps transforming these people.
Are you talking about a more recent study, like the Michael Bogenschutz study with alcohol dependent?
No, this is in the film, earlier on in the film.
Oh, because I was going to say, Michael Bogenschutz like revived all of this, and he found kind of two things that are relevant to what you're asking. One is that a lot of people with serious alcohol dependence needed much higher doses of psilocybin to have a mystical experience. And so they had to start testing the safety of these higher doses, because for a lot of the people who'd been drinking their whole lives, 30 milligrams was not going to cut it. They needed to even double it sometimes. So that's kind of fascinating, that for both psychological and physical reasons, you need a much higher dose of a psychedelic to address that kind of, physiology. And the mystical experience was related to the degree to which the treatment intervention worked. So I think all of the recent studies have just confirmed that something about the mystical experience does seem to predict treatment outcomes, whether it's nicotine or alcohol, I think there are some people who are starting to look at things like body dysmorphic disorder, you know, people with eating disorders. I met a woman once who was convinced she was queer growing up in a kind of conservative culture, and she and her friends were going to go on some like cruise together, and she almost canceled on the cruise so that she could end her life. But then she took MDMA instead, and then like she was fine. And she said that she felt like MDMA was like the thing that told her that like who she was like inside was like totally okay, even though like the culture around her was telling her like there was something wrong with her identity. And I was like, why haven't we done that study? Like, that's so important, you know? It's like you were, you know, a teenager, and if you hadn't had the intuition to treat yourself, you wouldn't have gotten to be 25 and enrolled in a, you know, in a study that said it was like safe. You were old enough to have that experience. So
right. And that was not a therapeutic experience necessarily.
no, it was just, it was just her.
Wow, fantastic. And what about, I guess, the sense of, you know, the mystical experience being so important? Is it fairly reliable that people will reach that if they just take X amount of whatever?
Oh, what was I actually did this study, and now it's kind of like, I think what we found was that you had a half the chance of having a full-blown mystical experience if you took mushrooms on your own than if you did it at Hopkins. So basically at the Hopkins study, it was like 60 to 70% of people had a full-blown mystical experience with all of the preparation, you know, all of the support. And in the,
that's what you'd attribute. That's what you would attribute it to, right? It's the preparation and the support.
Right.
Really helps.
And then in the survey that we did of thousands of people reporting on their most personally meaningful mushroom experience, it was only 30% had a full-blown mystical experience according to the same questionnaire. And so even the people who were self-selecting to complete a survey because they'd had a meaningful mushroom experience, the number was only a third having that mystical experience. And so, I mean, it does seem like something about that specialized container does increase the chance of having this thing that then contributes to the long-term benefits. But I don't think it has to be a clinical setting. It's more just the quality of the support and the safety of the container, which you can create in a community setting, you can create in a friend setting. It's hard to find the right friend, I would say.
Yeah, I hear you on that. Right.
Was it in the Hopkins study that somebody with the placebo was reported to have a mystical experience?
Yeah, a few people.
A few people.
No, a few people. So, but they didn't get nothing. They got a high dose of Adderall. And so for people who've never had a drug experience before, a high dose of Adderall can feel quite amazing. And so with the music and with the whole immersive thing, I think it was like 4 out of 36 people in the Adderall condition had a mystical experience. So, I mean, I think what that speaks to is how powerful the music and the container are. I mean, I'm sure there are people who would just have a mystical experience with the music alone. And so I don't think that says anything so special about Adderall. It just points to that we had a pretty strong placebo response, but not, you know, it was mostly the psilocybin that made the difference. It wasn't like half the people in the placebo condition and like a few more in the psilocybin condition.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting they gave them Adderall in the Hopkins trials, because that does sort of create a sensation, especially early on, that does sort of mimic like the early onset of psilocybin.
Well, you know, I mean, Roland was a trained drug abuse researcher, and he didn't want to believe. I mean, it's hard to describe. He was he's a devout meditator. He's very spiritual, but he didn't want to get a result that he could question. He wanted to really believe the result. And so he designed a study that he was like, all right, if psilocybin is really doing this thing, it will be better than Adderall. It will be better than just the music. It won't matter. You know, it was like, you could throw the kitchen sink, and the kitchen sink plus psilocybin should be so obviously better than every other thing combined. And so that's kind of, he designed it to be, he didn't want the placebo condition to be like a non-comparison.
Mm-hmm.
That's great
The
dedication.
NYU studies, I don't think they give them. I don't think they definitely don't give them Adderall, but I don't think they give them anything. I think it's just an empty pill. I'm pretty sure.
I forget. I mean, it's gone through different phases at Hopkins too. By the time I got there, everyone was getting psilocybin. And so it was just how much. So you could get basically enough, like 1 milligram would be your placebo day, and all the way up to 30 per, 150 pounds. And so by the time I got there, it was actually a cleaner way of preparing people, because with informed consent, we're like, you will get psilocybin on every single session. It may just be an amount that you can't detect, and so it just makes it a lot easier in terms of in the first study, people were told, they were given a list of 20 drugs, and on any given day, they had to expect that they might get any drug listed on that 20 drug list. So it was a very different kind of study than people are now doing with psilocybin or MDMA.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like you guys were the first microdosers, perhaps placebo microdosers. Now, were people excluded with developmental traumas, and some of these other things in the study? Or if not, do you think that had a bearing on anything that you could tell?
I mean, the person who could really answer that is Mary, because Mary Casamano was the person who basically met everybody for the first time. And so it was her job to assess someone for like suitability to kind of make it through the whole study. Psychologically, in terms of their social support, their family situation, their professional financial situation, could they make it through the whole thing? And so I think there are a lot of people that Mary probably interviewed who we never even got to see, because she only wanted the people to get through who were suited for that particular study, but also like had a lot of support, were healthy, could deal with the ups and downs of the experience. And so, like I said, there were the people who kind of got through with developmental trauma were the ones who had developed really excellent coping strategies as throughout their life. So as adults, they could basically appear totally fine. And we never did an intentional study where we were looking at whether psilocybin was appropriate for something like complex PTSD or even acute trauma. And so I think that's a big question mark for me, is like, is psilocybin, are mushrooms suitable for people with trauma? And like, what are the risks and benefits? Because I've seen a lot of people kind of go sideways with mushrooms who have complex trauma, and I don't think it always helps. And it can help, but it takes a while. So like I think we were talking about before everyone jumped on, is in my experience, the mushroom experience I had at 33, it was like, I describe it in this book that I'm writing now, and it's hard to describe in a short way, but it was almost like I was in an amusement park my whole life, and I thought it was this fun amusement park. And then this loss that I experienced like pulled the facade away, and I suddenly saw that it was like a horror show. And I had to accept that that was my life. And I couldn't reconcile that I had such an enjoyable life, and that it was also like deep down this like horror show. And so it's like the mushrooms revealed that, because in their intelligence, and I'm not saying in like it doesn't have to be, supernatural way. They have an intelligence in how they interact, they're beings, they're living beings. Their type of intelligence is just to illuminate and connect and reveal things. And so it's like, for them, it's like they're not trying to do harm, but it's like what I saw was not going to make me feel better. And so, and then I had to kind of take a detour and go into the somatic therapy route to understand what appeared to be a nightmare. Because it wasn't a nightmare, it was just like the beginning of understanding all of this stuff that was underneath. And that's like where the mushrooms are really good at showing people, is like the underground. And so, when I think about the clinical model that's being recommended right now, especially for people with depression, people don't become depressed as adults because they necessarily had great childhoods. And so if you're dealing with major depression as an adult and you're thrown into a room and given a high dose of psilocybin and a couple therapy sessions, I mean, it's not going to cut it. You know, it's like, where's the community support? Where's the like ongoing support? Because it could take 10 years. It could take longer to like really work that through. At Hopkins, we never studied that. So I think it's still a question mark for me, you know, what's the risk for people with complex trauma? And what's the trajectory, the timeline that it's going to take? It still may be worth it, you know?
Yeah.
Psilocybin plus 10 years of therapy is still, the person gets their whole life back.
Right.
Which is amazing.
Right. Yeah. And I would hope it wouldn't be 10 years, but psilocybin on board.
I saw people in integration circles who, you know, it was like decades. It was just like their ongoing self-improvement project. And that's what they wanted to do. And it was their choice, you know?
Right. Right. Sounds great. So, you know, wanting to be mindful of the time here because Katherine is in a different time zone that's a little bit later than we are. So, if there's any more questions, right, you know, again, I don't know how, if you want to stay, if there's more, there's Jacob has a question from Denver. Go ahead, Jacob.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment more than a question. As to the film, I really loved the archival footage. I've never seen a lot of that before. I think I've seen a lot of these documentaries on the subject, but I don't know, can you talk about the research that goes into, you know, finding that stuff? And I love the bicycle day, or, you know, the bicycle ride audio tape. That was a really cool piece too.
Yeah, that was a great piece. That was an interview I found by a guy named Peter Gorman, and he was writing an article for High Times magazine, I believe in the 80s, maybe late 80s or early 90s. So he interviewed Albert Hoffman along with Ken Kesey and a whole bunch of other people. So that interview was fantastic, and that was really good to hear from Hoffman directly. And there's a funny thing actually in the beginning of that tape. He calls Albert Hoffman on the phone, and Albert Hoffman's like, yeah, what are you doing? What is this for? And they have this back and forth where Hoffman makes him pay like $500 to get the interview, even though Peter Gorman like didn't have a budget for this. And I think he had to like pay it himself or something. So I almost left that in, but then I thought it sort of might reflect poorly on Hoffman. But yeah, hilarious. A lot of that black and white stuff was this funny thing where, you know, I was like a film student and then working on this afterwards, you know, on my own time and pretty much on my own budget. And so you go for stuff that's free, and stuff that's free is anything produced by the US government is in the public domain, and you don't have to pay a licensing fee to use it in your film. So that's where I started. And then I just found these incredible old films that were done in the 50s and 60s where they're giving people LSD and kind of recording what happened. And so the bulk of that was really government footage, which some of it was like the CIA, experiments the CIA was doing. Some of it was from the Food and Drug Administration, and also the National Institute of Mental Health too. But yeah, there's just that incredibly rich stuff that's in the National Archives. If you look it up in the U.S. National Archives.
I love the announcers in those clips. And now they're taking LSD.
Yeah.
100 micrograms.
Yeah. Exactly. It's like, yeah, that old like 50s way of talking. It's so great.
Wasn't there a film a long time ago called Better Living Through Chemistry? But although I don't think it was about psychedelics. But
I don't know that. I know that phrase, which was kind of like a sort of like motto of the counterculture. But I don't know about that film.
So I know there's someone working on something about the Shoguns. I don't think it's finished, but that was.
Better Living Through Chemistry, wasn't that Sam Rockwell?
Yeah, right.
That was it. Yeah, I remember that. It was okay.
There's something I'd love to get Katherine's thoughts on, if there's time, but I don't want to keep you.
I'm okay. It's already way past my bedtime, so at this point, it doesn't matter. It's just like it's an alternate reality. So.
Well,
Yeah, there's just, there's been so much development like the past couple of years with like kind of the mainstreaming of psychedelics. And there's all this tension between like decriminalization efforts, legalization efforts, and people who want to kind of stay in the clinical model. And there's also been like the introduction of pharmaceutical companies basically trying to get into the space. And I'm just kind of curious what like your thoughts are on what direction you think makes sense kind of moving forward with all these different pieces.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I've grown quite cynical about most of the business and kind of corporate efforts to kind of mainstream, especially psilocybin. Although I guess I have a little bit more faith with MDMA, just because I think it's the drug itself works more therapeutically, even when you're not trying to achieve a therapeutic outcome. And so I think MDMA will almost certainly work for its intended purpose, and it's hard to misuse it. As long as you have accountability with the therapists. I think the biggest risk to patients is from therapists who choose to harm patients, which happens and has already happened in clinical trials. With psilocybin, I don't have a whole lot of faith in the clinical model that's being kind of put forward, which is like, mostly for people with depression. I don't think it's the right outcome to focus on. I think a lot of people with depression could benefit from a lot of other types of therapy first. And I don't see psilocybin ultimately being that effective. I think it will help some people. I was actually speaking with one of the directors of a psychedelic therapy center recently, and I said that I see the community model to be at the center, and I see therapy and clinical practice to be an adjunct to the community model. And I think it's often talked about the opposite, where it's like you treat people clinically, and then if they're safe enough and they're okay, then they can take it with their friends. I see it the opposite. I think you can trust people with their friends. I think you can trust a lot of communities who have a range of experience, and then you can reach out to the medical community as needed. And it's actually interesting. I've kind of convinced some of my colleagues over time to really take a closer look at the community model, the decrim model. And I think a lot of the boogeymen that they thought existed, they exist in the therapy setting too. They exist in the medical community. It's like people who want to abuse vulnerable people exist in every segment of society. They're doctors, they're politicians, they're, your neo-shaman guru, they're all over the place. And so if the risks are the same, I would choose the community kind of friendship model over the medical model, unless there's like a real strong medical underlying condition, like a cardiac condition. What if you have someone who has such severe PTSD that they don't want to be alive anymore, but they have a cardiac condition where they could have a serious, if not fatal, reaction to MDMA? How do you make that decision? That could be a great place to use a medical setting. I've talked to friends who work in emergency departments, physicians, who say, like, we could easily have an intervention with people with ketamine here in the emergency department and have a major therapeutic outcome, but we need to convince the corporate culture here that giving ketamine is life-saving for someone who's acutely suicidal. So I've had a lot of conversations with medical doctors where I think there are specific ways that psychedelics could be incorporated medically. But over and over again, I just kind of see that for most people, ultimately taking psychedelics with people that they know and love is going to be the best thing for them in the long run. And so I'm all for decrim, I'm all for the community model. And I'm really against, people patenting. What was the thing about the compass pathways, patenting soft cushions and hand holding?
Right. It's crazy.
That should just tell you how absurd the profit-based model is. It's like people have been using couches to take drugs since there have been couches. It's like...
Can I ask a question? Is that okay?
Yeah.
We've actually been having a rather interesting debate lately about what the standards should be for people that would be listed as therapists in general, not necessarily licensed, but like the qualifications. And it's been a hotly debated item. And you're right. There's been lots of abuses in the therapeutic model, both from people that have like solid degrees because they have a very high percentile of having too many relations with their patients, and then also like the fringers that are out there in like Jamaica and whatnot doing whatever. So we've been trying to figure out like what would be the criteria in essence for a good therapist in that regard, or a guide in some relation, because I honestly I tend to trust my friends far more than anybody else I know. That's just how I am. So like, if not even figuring out the logistics how to get there, but what would be in your vision like the perfect utopian model for what psychedelic therapy should look like in like 50 years? I know that's a complex question, I'm sorry, but it's like,
it is a complex question. I think I'm getting caught because I don't I used to think there was such a thing as like good and bad people and good and bad therapists. And now I don't believe that anymore. So I'm like kind of hearing my past self say, oh, this is how you pick a good therapist. And then I think, oh no, like you can't just, because like I used to just tell women, trip with other women. But now I've heard about women who are very well respected, lots, names that you would recognize, like, lots of training, who've chosen to, for example, have sex with their clients. And it's like, oh, so women do the same thing that men do. So that can't be a criteria, So I've stopped making that suggestion because it's just too limited. I think what I would say is that in general, I don't know if Dan of TAM Integration, Daniel. So Daniel, yeah. So Daniel and I put on an event on 9/20 in 2019 that was called Afterglow. And it was right after everything was decriminalized in Oakland. And Dan was living there. I actually flew in for the event. And we didn't tell people they had to trip. We didn't tell them anything about what they could choose to do, but we provided everything that we thought would create a really safe container for a psychedelic experience that lasted about 3 to 4 hours.
They're good.
Yeah. But we went a step further. We were like, this isn't Zendo project. This isn't like, come to us if you're having a hard time. This is like, bring every other intention you would bring to a therapeutic setting, but we're not going to give you the drugs and we're not going to tell you how to take the drugs. So you're assuming the risk of the drug taking, but we're providing the container. And it was actually amazing. 20 strangers, I'm sure some people knew each other, but 20 people came together for a single night. And I was just looking around and I was like, this is as well executed as any session I've ever done at Hopkins. There were no incidents. Everyone, there was one person who had a diabetic incident and someone like helped them with their insulin by the bathroom. But it's like, I was amazed. And I remember saying to Daniel, I was like, how did that go so well? Like we didn't even work together professionally before that moment. Like, how did the sound people know how to like work with what we were doing? And like this woman who I had also flown in, who I had never worked with, she was able to support people. It all flowed. And he said, because we're all professionals. And it's like when you show up with that intention of professionally supporting people, but in a mode of friendship and community, I mean, a single event like that could work as well as something that's orchestrated over years and like developed over years. And so I think the safest way for most people to take psychedelics is in a group without a single leader, without a guru, without a shaman, without a therapist, but with a group of professionals who are all holding each other accountable and where everyone can see what everyone is doing. Because it's really hard to intentionally hurt someone if you got 5 other professionals watching what you're doing and 20
100%
people.
Transparent. That's brilliant.
I think that's it. And the only other thing I would add, because this is how I've had experiences more recently, is if you have enough experience in a group, I think that solo experiences can be extremely therapeutic. If you have enough kind of background support, you know what you're doing, you've like explored the territory enough. And I've heard a couple other anecdotes of like women with trauma feeling the safest having a solo experience first, when they know that there's like a friend that they can call in the middle of the session if they need to, but they can ensure that the space is safe because there's no one that they don't trust in that space. It's like they're the only one in that space. They don't have to trust like a friend or a therapist or like a guide. And it goes against a lot of my training. It's like, how could you be alone in this experience? But you're not alone. You still have the medicine, you have the music, you have all this other support. And so I think and you see where I'm getting at. I'm getting away from this idea of like two strangers in a room with one vulnerable person, or one stranger in the room with one vulnerable person. That has got to go. I just don't think it's going to work.
Community itself is in essence protecting them. That's brilliant. No, that's perfect. That's I don't.
So those are my best
I
secrets.
violate
Please
that.
disseminate them.
Now, what about, I'm thinking that sometimes some of the things I've heard is that people that are wounded in relationship need to heal in relationship. And that's where a one-on-one could be very hopeful. But could you do that one-on-one within the group? In other words, if one person out of the 20 was having, some deeper issues come up, could that work in that context as well? Or would it be better taking them off to the side, or maybe there's a place for one-on-one somewhere? But
I mean, when Lene Ponte and I did the Zendo work together in South Africa, we had the big space where people could come, and often people were tripping. And then we created what we called the womb space, which was like a little tent within the bigger tent that people could go into if they needed more like privacy and like a container. And, if everyone else is tripping, no one's like paying attention to your private thing that's going on in the womb tent. I mean, it's really like how safe the person feels. And then back to the transparency, accountability piece, the person who was in that space with that one person would always have someone else checking in and would like switch out if needed. And I saw this happen a lot with Zendo Project, that like different people would just not vibe with whoever showed up. And so it's like not taking it personally and like calling in someone else who's better suited. Or if you see someone doing something that doesn't seem quite right, rather than make a big deal out of it, you're like, hey, can I sit with this person for a bit? Why don't you take a break? And it just, I think as long as people aren't going in with a big ego of needing to be the person, the hero who saves someone, it works. It's like you have this amazing team and like everything is just flowing. And so I think I don't see a downside unless someone just really doesn't feel safe showing up in a group like that. And I could imagine like my mom would never show up to like a community event like that. So it's like, again, I think for different demographics, the smaller container, but like she would probably do it with a group of like 2 or 3 other women her age. It's like just having camaraderie, I think, is important.
I love that. Yeah, fantastic.
But Brian Anderson did that with the HIV study. It was he couldn't convince the powers that be to let him dose in groups, but he did all of the prep and all of the integration with these men who had been in this long-term survivorship community together in San Francisco. They'd all had multiple traumas and losses related to HIV, and they were long-term survivors. And so the study was structured so that everything was done as a group except for the dosing. And Brian actually asked me very early on, and I said, insist on group dosing. And he couldn't get the powers that be to agree to it. So it's like the best was the group prep and the group integration. And so this will be like the watershed moment when someone finally convinces the powers that be that you can dose a group of people together and it will be fine.
Right. Yeah, that's fantastic. I love that. And then I guess the optimal size group would be a question, perhaps. And you said you worked with 20 approximately in San Francisco at that point.
I mean, that was a lot, but it was also, it was kind of a fun event. I think if it was more therapeutically driven, I wouldn't want to go more than 10.
Yeah.
Even in Jamaica, we had way too many people for the one retreat that I was in charge of. And I thought if the group were half this size, it would be a better experience for everyone and people would get more out of it.
I want to just thank everyone so much for coming. I want to thank Pat for making such an awesome film. I want to thank Katherine for graciously staying up late and coming out to chat with us about it. Really a fantastic discussion.
I just want to say thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and it's great to have these discussions and get one-on-one feedback with everybody. So yeah, thank you so much.
And Pat, I want to thank you for being one of the kindest people who has ever sought me out to do an interview or a film project. Because as you may remember, I said no quite a few times. And then when you finally showed up, I was like, wow, he's so nice. I was like, this is a pleasure. I was like, why was I so rude?
I'm so glad I got Katherine in the film, because she was one of the last rounds of interviews that I did. So, and we were just talking before the session. It was in December of 2019, so right before COVID hit, really. So I got super lucky with that.
You know, when people used to go to each other's houses who didn't know each other.
I know. We probably shook hands, like craziness.
So very happy to be a part of it. Thank you for your contribution. I think in another very short period of time, people will look back on this and realize, like, this film captures so much of the beginning of, I mean, I think it's just going to explode from here. And there aren't going to be many ways of documenting what these early years were like. And this film does it. So I think I see it almost as like a time capsule. It's like, how do you put LSD into a time capsule? How do you put mushrooms into a time capsule? And this might be one of the ways. So
without taking it yourself, of course.
yeah.
Yeah, somebody made the comment, it's like, it's the psychedelic movie I want to show my parents. It's like kind of, yeah, Psychedelics 101 in a way. So
Right.
Thanks so much. It means a lot to me.
Thank you, Paul, for organizing this.
Yeah, thank you so much.